Welcome and thanks for listening to another show of The Health Zone. I'm Mícheál Ó Mathúna. Check out and like our Facebook page on www.facebook.com/The Health Zone Show, or follow us on Twitter on the letter D Health Zone, or log on to our website on www.thehealthzoneshow.com. If you subscribe to our mailing list on there, you will get the Health Zone Show delivered to your inbox every week, and also you'll get a copy of our free ebook called How to Transform Your Health in 2016. Also, if you have any feedback on the show, or if you would like to get in touch with us, our email is tunein@thehealthzoneshow.com. Today I'm talking with founder of Children in Crossfire, Richard Moore. Hello, Richard.
Hello, Mícheál. How are you doing?
Very good. How are you doing?
Very good. No complaints today.
That's great to hear. So, tell me, Richard, a little bit about yourself.
Okay, well, I'm from Derry in Northern Ireland. I've lived there all my life. I'm 54 years of age now, so I was born in 1961 in Derry. I remember Derry pre-conflict times in the early 60s as a young boy and running around the Cregan estate in Derry, which was a large sort of Catholic nationalist area in the city, and and I can remember my childhood with great fondness. The sort of things that every youngster would have done in those days, playing football or whatever, and then I obviously remember the conflict in Northern Ireland, and of course we're all enjoying now the peace process. I suppose for me in 1972 my life changed quite significantly, in the sense that the conflict kicked off around 1968, 1969 in the streets of Derry, and what seemed like overnight for me as a young boy, the Cregan estate became a war zone. You had these bizarre things happening, like the people in the area digging up the pavements outside on the street and breaking them up and using them as missiles to throw at the British Army or the police, or they build barricades at the end of each street. There was hijacked vehicles, burnt out cars, burnt out buses, all thrown across the road, and they were all used to build barricades. I remember, you used to watch the young men of the area. They seemed like men to me, but they're probably young boys, 17 or 18, running around in these hijacked dumper trucks, collecting bottles to take down to where the riots were happening, so they could make petrol bombs or whatever. And it was that's to me just seemed like overnight. Shootings, bombings, riots were a daily occurrence. And I suppose in January 1972 something very significant happened in Derry, and that was Bloody Sunday. And where 13 people were shot dead by British paratroopers on the streets of Derry. At least 5 or 6 of those people lived within maybe 30 seconds or 40 seconds walk from my house. So as you can imagine, the area was very volatile. I can remember my brother taking me down to the Bogside, which was just, again about maybe 10 minutes walk from where I lived. But I remember him driving me down to the Bogside the day after Bloody Sunday and seeing all the pools of blood, congealed blood, where people had been shot dead or shot and injured the day before. And one of the starkest images for me, strangely enough, was walking into St Mary's Chapel in the Cregan and seeing 13 coffins on the altar. And I went to Mass every Sunday in the Cregan, and you maybe would have seen one coffin every so often where somebody had died and they kept the coffin just at the side of the altar there. But to walk on and see 13 coffins across the altar was like something that you saw in a foreign country. like when a terrible disaster happened. And funny, that's the one thing that struck me about the whole thing in many ways. As well as that, my uncle Jared McKinney, my mother's brother, was shot dead on Bloody Sunday, so obviously that had a particularly significant impact. But the reason why I'm talking about Bloody Sunday is because I think, well, arguably the weeks and months that followed Bloody Sunday were among the most violent period in the history of the Northern Ireland conflict. I think more people died in the year after Bloody Sunday or the year following Bloody Sunday than in any other year throughout the conflict. And the Craigan and Derry was a very sort of volatile place. The Craigan estate became known as a no-go area, as did the Bogside. And like, I don't know if you're familiar with Derry, Mícheál, but you know, Derry is a very hilly city. You have the river going through the centre of the city. So you have the West Bank, where back in those days all mainly nationalists lived. And then you have the East Bank, where mainly the Unionist community lived or the Protestant community lived. So we're not only divided religious wise and political wise, but also divided geographically as well. But it was a sloping city, and everything sloped down towards the river, a lot of hills and all that. And the Craigan estate was probably one of the highest points in the city, and that sloped down into the Bogside, and then the Bogside, right beside the Bogside, you had the city centre. And you know, so the Craigan and the Bogside became known as no-go areas, and that's what the barricades were for. The barricades were there to stop the British Army or the police from infiltrating the areas easily. And the areas became known as a no-go area. That's the term that was used to describe it by the military and everything else. So by and large, the people of the Craigan policed themselves. It wouldn't have been unusual to see an IRA foot patrol walking down the streets, masked men carrying rifles. You would have found an IRA checkpoint where, you know, cars were being stopped by IRA men. You know, I can remember myself walking down and standing beside IRA men, and they would let you hold their rifle and things like that. Just, you know, obviously for a minute or 30 seconds or whatever. So I went to a school called Rosemount Primary School, and Rosemount Primary School and St Joseph's Secondary School were both on the edge of the Craigan estate. So I was 10 years of age when Bloody Sunday happened. But because of where the two schools were on the edge of the Craigan estate, the two schools were beside a police barracks. And because of where the police barracks was located on the edge of a no-go area, then it was a target for the IRA and a target for rioters. So the British Army were brought in to protect the barracks, the police barracks. So you had these, what I would describe as semi-permanent military installations. We called them army lookout posts, sangers, or sandbag posts, and they were all the same thing. And it was basically a military hut. You know, there were the front of them you had barbed wire, and then behind that you had corrugated sheets of corrugated iron going from the ground right up and over to make a roof. And then behind the corrugated iron, the army built walls made out of like cloth potato bags filled with sand, and they were all piled on top of each other to build walls. And then in behind that, the army looked out through a kind of a porthole. And the purpose of these lookout posts were to protect the army from bombs and bullets, basically. One of these army lookout posts faced up in between my school, Rosemount Primary School, and St Joseph's Secondary School. So about 3-4 months after Bloody Sunday, the 4th of May 1972, I got out of school as normal. I ran along me and my friends had a race along the football pitch of St Joseph's School, which was just positioned, between the two schools. So we're having a race. And in doing that, we had to pass this army lookout post on our right hand side. And when I was about 10 feet away from it, a British soldier fired a rubber bullet. The rubber bullet hit me on the bridge of the nose. I lost my right eye and was left completely blind on my left eye. You know, what I remember about that day was obviously racing with my friends. And then the next thing I remember, I woke up and I was lying in the school canteen table. And what happened was my music teacher, Mr. Giles Doherty, heard the bang. He ran over, found me lying on the ground and lifted me and carried me and laid me out on the school canteen table. And then the next thing I remember is I woke up in the ambulance, and at that stage my daddy and my sister were beside me. I only lived about 2 minutes walk from the school, so somebody obviously ran up to our house and told me daddy I'd been shot, and him and my sister came running down the hill, and he jumped into the ambulance beside me. So that was me really. I spent about 2 weeks in hospital, and all during that time I didn't know I was blind. I thought I couldn't see because of the bandages on my eyes. So I thought it was the bandages that were preventing me from seeing. So I was kind of a football fanatic, Mícheál, and you know, I loved playing football. And I remember when they moved me out into the general ward after about a week, you know, when I come out of intensive care, I remember joking with a wee boy in the bed opposite me, saying to him, you know, I can't wait to get these bandages off my eyes till I teach you how to play football. You know, we young lads joke. And I think, you know, on reflection now, that must have been very difficult for my family. You know, I come from a big family. There's 12 children in our house, 9 boys and 3 girls. And because of the seriousness of the incident, they kind of kept a constant vigil around my bed. And, you know, I think when they heard me talking as if all I had to do was remove the bandages and everything would be back to normal, must have been very difficult for them because they knew the real story. You know, and they must have wondered, you know, how are we going to tell Richard he'll never play football again? How are we going to tell Richard he'll never be able to see again?
What was it like growing up then since that time when the accident happened?
Well, I didn't know that I was blind until about a month after I was shot. At that stage I was out of hospital. And my brother Noel took me for a walk up and down our back garden. And it wasn't unusual because he'd done that every kind of day to help build up my strength. But this particular day he said to me, Richard, do you know what has happened to you? And I said, yes, I knew I was shot. And he said, do you know what damage was done? And I said, no. And that's when he told me that I lost my right eye, you know, never be able to see again with my left eye. And to be honest, Mícheál, I just accepted it there and then. Literally took it in my stride that day. Until I went to bed that night. And when I was in bed on my own, I cried for the one and only time that I remember about blindness. And I cried because I realised for the first time that I was never going to see my mammy and daddy again. And that might seem strange, but you know, the 10-year-old boy, you know, you don't think about the bigger things in life. You don't think about getting a job. You don't think about your education. You don't think about, you know, how you're even going to cope with blindness or anything. All as I felt was this enormous sense of loss that I was never going to see my parents' faces again. And I cried myself to sleep that night. But the next day, I suppose I had to put the pieces of my life back together, and you know, I would always say that day was the first day of the rest of my life as a blind person. I was shot in May, so I didn't really go back to school until September, and I went to the primary school that I was shot in, and then went on into the secondary school, done all my exams there, and went to university in Coleraine. I got my degree in 1983, I got married in 1984 to Rita, and we have 2 children, Neve and Denya. Neve is now 26, she'll be 27 in March, and Enya was just 24 there on Friday past. So I've had a very active life, you know. I learned how to play the guitar and played in bands and all that sort of stuff, you know. And me and Rita, when we were 18 years of age, set up the Long Tower Folk Group. The Long Tower Chapel in Derry is it's also known as St. Columba's, and it's the Church of St. Columba's first monastic settlement in Derry. So it's it's got a lot of history and a lot of character to it. And for the last 35 years now, me and Rita have been running the folk group in there that sing a mass on a Saturday night. And as I say, I played in bands and all that. Never played quite as far down as Cork. Used to play in Carlow and places like that. So in Galway maybe, but never as far as Cork. So I mean, I was back in the sort of early 90s and stuff, and it kept me interested up in football. I became a director of Derry City Football Club, so for 4 or 5 years I was a director of the club. In fact, the last time Derry City was champions of Ireland, I was a director. So I was back in '97, I think, and it was a fantastic time. Felix Healy was the manager, and we had a great old time. In fact, many's an enjoyable trip we had down here to Turner's Cross, playing Cork City and stuff like that there, So, and I was compensated by the British government for being shot, and with half the money I bought a house, and with the other half I bought a pub. And 2 years later I bought a second pub. And so by the time I was 20 years of age, I owned 2 pubs in the centre of Derry. So when I come out of university, I had a wee office above one of the pubs straight in there and began to run my own business for about 14 years. So, but I suppose all during my self-employed life, and the older I got, kind of my early 20s and all that, I began to become very aware of who I was and, what happened, and, think about it in a way, that in an adult way, and began to realise how lucky I was. And began to ask myself some questions, and I sort of began to realise, there are children in other parts of the world that might have had their eyesight, but didn't have what I had. And when I look back, even then, when I look back on my life at that age, in the 20s or whatever, I had a very active, full, happy and contented life. Blindness wasn't a problem for me. I accepted blindness and it never really bothered me or anything. No, I'm not saying it didn't have its moments, but and doesn't have its physical drawbacks, occupational hazards, let's say. But generally, 99.999% of the time, I never thought about blindness. I was and am very happy. And I began to wonder why that was. And I suppose it comes down to 4 things for me. I always say 4 broad things. You could say 10 things or 8 things, but I always think 4 broad things, really. And one of them is the fact that I come from a good family. And despite the the challenges in my family, or that I was facing, my family were fantastic. And then I come from a good community. And again, the support back in those days, Mícheál, in the 70s, you had no such thing as trauma counsellors or all that sort of I suppose structural support that might exist there. It wasn't there. So the people that helped me and helped my family were the local community. And then the third thing, despite the poverty and the challenges that existed in Derry and Northern Ireland and all that sort of stuff in those days, despite all of that, I still had choices and opportunities available to me, even as a blind person. And as I say, I suppose in my young adult years, I began to realise, there are things worse than blindness in life. And I remember thinking one time, I'd rather live in Northern Ireland than deal with blindness, than have to live in a developing country in Africa, for example. and deal with the challenges that young children had to face there in terms of the injustice of poverty. So eventually around 1996 I sold out the business and I set up an organisation called Children in Crossfire. So Children in Crossfire are celebrating their 20th anniversary this year. And over those 20 years, the organisation has supported projects in Africa, Asia and South America. In partnership with a variety of organisations. We've worked in countries like Malawi, Mozambique, Kenya, Colombia, Brazil, Bangladesh, Ghana, Guinea and so on. Today we work in Tanzania and Ethiopia. And we work with some of the most vulnerable children on the planet. Children that wake up every day and don't know where their next meal's coming from. Children that don't have access to a drink of clean water. Children that don't have access to medicines that could help save their lives. Living in mud huts with no electricity, no running water, no toilets. And if they're lucky enough to get a meal, then it might be one meal a day. And I have the humbling experience of going out there to the country and visit the projects on a regular basis, and it's heartbreaking. It is heartbreaking. When you hold the hands of children who just don't have the opportunities that my children have. And, it does make you wonder sometimes about the cruelty in the world, and the injustices in the world. And all these children are asking for is the same basic human rights that you and me have come to expect for our children. They just need to be protected and loved and supported. Many of these children die before they're 5 years of age. In some places 1 in every 5 die before they're 5 years of age. And I remember, for example, going to Ethiopia and I remember when I went there, I was met by the Franciscan Mission of Our Lady, the nuns there, at the airport, and they took me to a graveyard. But not to see the dead, to see the living. Or you might say people who were barely alive. And yet 260 people living and sleeping on top of graves. Young families, children, at least 50% of them would have been children. And the young girls there were child prostitutes, selling their bodies on the streets of Addis Ababa. Young girls, 7 or 8 years of age. Mentally, physically, sexually abused every single day of their lives. They didn't have food. They were clearly malnourished. And I remember there was one young girl called Tanaya, and I always talk about Tanaya, because Tanaya's parents both died, and she was left in charge of her 4 siblings. She was only 13 or 14 herself, and there were 4 younger children. There's no network out there, there's no safety net, there's no welfare system. She was left to look after these 4 children living in a graveyard under a house made out of bits of plastic or bits of bamboo, lying and sleeping on top of graves. I often compare Tanaya's life to my children's life, and my daughters, and thank God, she just deserves the same chances and the same breaks as my children. Children in Crossfire, that's one example of the project. Children in Crossfire got involved, and we put a feeding programme in place initially in 2008, and then I was paid for medical support in the graveyard so they could deal with whatever illnesses that were there. And then there was a teacher went in there, and we paid for a teacher to go in, and we set up a school underneath a tree so the kids could start attending school. But the day that I went to visit them initially, there was a torrential rainstorm, and all 260 people were just sitting in the mud waiting to media arrive, because they thought that I represented hope, a way out. And I just remember the spokesperson that day said to me, if somebody doesn't do something soon, there'll be nobody here to help, because we'll all die. Now there has to be something wrong with a world that allows that to happen. You know, there has to be something wrong in a world where there's loads of resources. You know, where we seem to have no difficulty in finding the resources to, say, go into wars and all that sort of stuff. But we just can't seem to find the resources to save children's lives. And you know, I just think it's an awful act of injustice, really. So what I see children in Crossfire doing is trying to restore the rights of those people, to help them get their dignity back, to help them build a future for themselves. And I think every child in the world, in every village in the world, there's a Richard Moore, there's a Mícheál, there's a Mary, there's a Joe, who wants to be a teacher, who wants to be a doctor, who wants to be a bricklayer, who wants to be a mammy or a daddy. And just given the right chance and the right support, they can do all those things. You know, I remember one time being in Bangladesh, a project we supported in Bangladesh. Children were living in slum areas. And I was staying in this sort of room near the slum area. And it was about 9 o'clock at night and the electricity had gone off. There was a power cut. And just outside my room, where people lived in these sort of wooden huts in the middle of sewage and stuff. And I remember a child started to sing. And in its own language, it sang Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And I remember thinking, the tune's the same, the words are the same, but life is so different. And that child down there singing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star deserves the same opportunity in life as our children in Ireland who sing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. A child is a child, no matter where it is in the world, and deserves the same level of care and support and love that every child, an opportunity. I mean, come back to the graveyard scenario, then eventually we were able to fundraise, and with the support we received here in Ireland, we were able to buy 60 small condos, which is like, if you can imagine a 4 or 5 story building with 6 rooms in each corridor. Each room became a home. And at the end of the corridor there was a communal kitchen. Outside the building there were toilets, proper toilets. The building had electricity and had running water. And the families themselves inside, they separated each room, put a curtain across so that they could separate the bedroom from the living area. And I went back in 2011, and at that stage they were all in the condos, and the children were out waiting on us to arrive this time, as always. And it doesn't matter if it's me or you get a celebrity welcome. And the children were out dancing and singing in their school uniforms, properly fed, and they were happy. And make no mistake about it, they weren't getting burger and chips every day, or they weren't getting, cornflakes or Rice Krispies or all that. They were just getting a few stable meals a day, and it was just a life-changing experience. And when I left that day, I sort of thought about the difference between when I left the graveyard and it was a tropical rainstorm, and I couldn't get out of my head that they were all lying in the rain that night, and there was a thunderstorm, and here now I was leaving, and they were just so life was so different. And that was made possible by the support of people here. You know, so it is possible to make a significant difference. But I remember talking to Tanaya, the girl at that time, and at this stage, you know, she was obviously living in the condo, and now she was a classroom assistant and getting paid money, albeit it's not what a classroom assistant would get in Ireland. You know, probably 20 or £10 a month, 10 or £20 a month maybe. But I remember saying to her, "What's your biggest fear?" And she said her fear is that children in Crossfire would stop providing food. You know, and I often think, well, you know, how many of young people here have that worry? You know, but you know, it's a sad story in many ways, and it is a heartbreaking story, and it is an example of the challenges that exist in developing countries. But at the same time, there's a positive element to it in the sense that there's also an example there of what can be done given the right resources.
I know you're a personal friend of His Holiness the Dalai Lama as well, Richard. Tell me, what's your relationship like with him? I
am sort of very lucky to have had unique access to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and you know, I treasure all of that when it happens. But I suppose it all came about, you know, there's kind of four things in my life that as I mentioned earlier, that helped me cope, and you know, that basically made it possible for me to be the person I am today. And I already mentioned family, community, and opportunity. But the fourth thing is a lack of hatred and a lack of anger in my life. And you know, if you think of anger and you think of hatred, it's a self-destruct emotion. It destroys you from the inside out. You know, somebody once says to me, anger is like drinking a cup of poison and expecting the other person to die. And that is true. So, I hadn't got that anger. And I'm glad to say I hadn't got that anger. To the point where I was curious about the British soldier that shot me. Now, you know, I'm not going to pretend to you there are times in my life, you know, when I've missed my eyesight. And, you know, being shot and blinded the way I was has had an impact on everybody. Like my mother broke her heart. No, I can remember me mammy, just after I got out of hospital, coming up and kneeling beside my bed at night. And you know, my mammy and daddy were two very devout Catholics. Went to Mass every day. They were wonderful examples of parents. They really were. They didn't support violence. But you know, despite their best efforts of avoiding the troubles found us. My mammy's brother shot dead on Bloody Sunday, my Uncle Jared. And then 4 months later, I was blinded at the bottom of the school playground. And they must have wondered, what do they have to do to keep their family safe? And you know, I remember my mammy coming up, as I say, when I got out of hospital, and she used to come up and think I was lying in my bed and she thought I was sleeping, you know. And she'd kneel beside my bed and she'd start to say her prayers. And then she'd break down and start to cry. And the crying would get out of hand. You know, and she would start pleading with God, look at him, God, he's only a 10-year-old boy. Please give him back his eyesight. Please give him back his eyesight. And, you know, then I'd pretend to wake up and she'd kind of pull herself together. My daddy, he stood in the middle of our street the day he came back from the hospital. Stood in the middle of the street with a man out of the street and cried. Because he just told them that day that I was going to be blind for the rest of my life. And for different members of my family, it had an enormous impact. For me, I'm a very happy and contented blind person. I am. I genuinely am. And I'm not just saying that. You know, there are some positive things about blindness as well. But you know, there are times in my life when I've missed my eyesight. For example, when my two daughters were born. I would have given anything to see them. I was there in the ward when they come into the world for the first time, and everybody will tell you, any parent will tell you how magical that is. I couldn't see them. When they smiled for the first time, when they opened their eyes for the first time. And those moments I missed my eyesight. I remember when they made their first communions and their confirmations and got up the aisle of the Craigan Chapel, and everybody telling me how beautiful they looked, and I couldn't see them. And those moments, I missed my eyesight. And those moments I thought about the British soldier that shot me. But despite all of it, I never had a moment's anger, a moment's hatred, to the point where, as I said earlier, I was curious to know who he was. I didn't know his name until 2003. I didn't know his name until 2005. 33 years after I was shot. And his name's Charles. And in January 2006 I flew to Scotland on my own and met Charles for the first time. And I have to say it was one of the most amazing experiences in my life. And I suppose I learned two things about forgiveness that day. The first thing is forgiveness is a gift that you give to yourself. And what I mean by that is, if Charles wants my forgiveness, he has it. But that's not what's important. What's important for me and my heart is I forgive him. For my happiness, for my peace of mind. The second thing is forgiveness doesn't change the past, but it does change the future. And again, the fact that I forgive Charles won't give me back my eyesight, will it? It won't take away all the hurts that were caused to me and my family all those years ago. But what it did do and has done is change my future. And I don't believe that I would be the person I am today if I had been wrecked with anger, hatred and bitterness. So I met Charles then, and me and Charles are good friends ever since. But the reason why I'm telling you that in the context of the Dalai Lama, you asked me about the Dalai Lama. I first met His Holiness in Derry in 2001. I didn't know him from Adam. I just knew him the way everybody else knows him. And I was in the audience. He met a small group of victims, about 30 victims, in Derry. And I had no plans to say anything and all of that. But I remember him talking about forgiveness. And I never saw my story in the context of forgiveness. I never thought that I was forgiven or anything like that. But when I heard him talk about forgiveness, I remember thinking to myself, he's actually describing how I feel. So eventually I plucked up the courage and I put my hand up and I said, look, Your Holiness, I just have a comment to make. I just want you to know that how you have described forgiveness is exactly how I feel. And then we had a bit of a joke then. He said to me, you have great insight. And I said, well, you wouldn't mind telling my wife that. And so we had a bit of a laugh about that. And then I ended up, for some reason, there was a lunch prepared, and I ended up sitting beside him for lunch. And then he asked me to tell him more of my story. And he invited me out to India. And that was, I didn't need to take him up on his offer until 10 years later. But, so I remember anyway writing to him then, 5 or 6 years after I first met him, at that day, I remember writing to him and saying to him, look, I have met the British soldier. I told him I met the British soldier that shot me. And it was one of the most amazing experiences of my life. And I also then in that letter invited the Dalai Lama to Derry to speak at Children Crossfire's 10th anniversary. And I accepted the invite. And so I've met His Holiness now on quite a few occasions since that. And you know, to me, the Dalai Lama is everything that I believe in terms of compassion, forgiveness, love. You know, I think he's he's unique in the planet today. I can't think of any other person. I can't think of one other person that basically embodies in one person what he has. You know, when you look at his life, living in exile in Dharamshala, a whole nation of people have lost their homeland, and are living in exile. And he has managed to maintain a peaceful message throughout all his life in exile. And he's constantly held out the hand of friendship. You know, I just think he's a wonderful example of how we all should be, or try to be. You know, so for me to know him and to spend time with him and to have him as a patron of children in Crossfire is a real honour and a real privilege for me. And you know, sometimes I worry because he's not getting any younger, and you know, where are the examples in the world? You know, who can we look up to in many ways? And he is definitely unique in my book.
You talked about forgiveness. What do you think is the purpose of forgiveness?
Well, for me, we all meet challenges in our life. I mean, I lost my eyesight, which is, I suppose, a tad dramatic. But, you know, you know, but every day you have challenges in your life. You know, you could go out and somebody has scraped the bonnet of your car. There could be a child that whacked a football off your brand new BMW. There could be a neighbour that is basically throwing his cut grass into your garden. So on and so on and so on. There's small things and there's big things. There's family members and all that. But ultimately everybody wants to be happy, I think. Everybody needs to be happy for your own mental health, physical health and everything else. To harbour anger and hatred is, to me, is like a blockage in your system, in your emotional system. Now, I'm no expert in all that chakras and all this sort of stuff. I don't energy sort of pathways and all that. I'm not. But what I know is what I experienced in life. And you know, where you have anger and hatred, it is a blockage. You know, it is a way of preventing you from being happy. And if you can find a pathway through the challenges that you face in life, because not all challenges are about the kid hitting their ball off your BMW either. There's a lot of people dealing with very serious, difficult challenges in life. So if you can find a way that you can deal with those hurts and those angers, then you will be a happier person. And I think forgiveness, it's probably not the only way to do it, but it's certainly the only way that I know to do it. And forgiveness is a great pathway that you can release yourself. You know, I always say I'd have been really angry with Charles the soldier or the British Army. Everybody would have understood it. I could have been banging my fist and banging the table and saying, you know, I hit them. And everybody would have understood that. They would have said, you know, you do right to hit them. It's totally understandable. They blinded you. They took away your eyesight. It's affected your life for the rest of your life. But I don't think I would have been happy. Instead, I had that gift of forgiveness that was given to me, by the way, by my parents. You know, their example. I never heard my mommy or daddy say an angry word. not an angry word. Witnessed a lot of tears, a lot of emotion. They were broken-hearted. They were broken-hearted. I mean, their 10-year-old boy out kicking football one day, doing fancy flips with a ball out in the backyard. I can remember one of my brothers was out in our kitchen with my mammy just after I was shot. We lived in a small house in the Craigan, so when you were sitting in one room, you could hear the conversations in the other room. And my mammy always spent her time in the kitchen, And I remember one of my brothers was out in the kitchen. One of the brothers just older than me. He was about 16 or 17 at the time. And I remember him having a real go at me mammy. Maybe venting his anger with my mammy, really. That's, when he was saying things like, they murdered my Uncle Gerard. They blinded Richard. It's time to get our own back. And he was obviously advocating some kind of violent retaliation. And I remember my mammy saying to him, if you want to help Richard, go you in there and you help Richard. But you're not helping Richard by hurting somebody else. And I think in that moment, my mammy drew a line in the sand and said, enough is enough. There's nothing to be achieved for the idea of an eye for an eye. And, I think in that day, she lifted the football and decided we're going to play a different game. We're going to take it in a different direction. And, and I think your original question is, why do we need forgiveness? I think we need forgiveness, firstly, for our own happiness, because it provides an avenue through which you can begin to heal yourself, and also a way in which you can find happiness and contentment. Now, does it justify it? I often get asked that question. The fact that I forgive Charles, does it justify him blinding me? No, it doesn't. And I think people often confuse forgiveness with justification. What Charles did was wrong. It was dreadfully wrong. It was unjustified and unjustifiable. Firing a rubber bullet at a group of children in a school playground, in any circumstances, in any language, in any nation in the world, cannot be justified in any way. Charles acted wrong and acted outside the law. But I'm not talking about the law. I'm talking about me and how I feel and how do I deal with it. Because sometimes people get justice, but they're no happier at the end of it. And if Charles had been locked up in jail and the key thrown away, if I had been feeling angry and full of hatred, I don't think I would have felt any better if that happened. Now, that's where we're kind of under the personal side of my story. Because what's right for me may not be right for everybody else. And, Mícheál, I understand that. There are people out there listening to this programme who could be hurting from a whole host of things and find it hard to forgive and find it hard to buy into the sense of logic that I'm kind of presenting now. That is totally understandable. It is totally understandable. But I offer my story out in the hope that somebody out there who is hurting, who is down a cul-de-sac, can find a way to release themselves. Because forgiveness is not about freeing up the other person. Forgiveness is not about justifying the hurt that somebody inflicted on you. Forgiveness is about you beginning to find a way that you can find happiness and contentment. After that, you can deal with the issue of justice if you so wish. In my case, and I emphasise in my case, I forgive Charles unconditionally. I don't want them to spend a day in jail. I don't want them to be hurt in any way. I think every situation has its own sort of basis or background or story to tell. So for me, my thinking is, in unusual circumstances, sometimes unusual things happen. And there's no doubt about it, Northern Ireland was an unusual place to be in the 70s. For me, for a policeman, for young men, for young women, and for soldiers. And sometimes when you have these unusual things, as I said, unusual things happen. Sometimes normal values kind of go out the window, even though it's wrong. And, I think we're all lucky if we get through our life without doing things that we'll have to regret for the rest of our lives. And I think that Charles done something that he regretted for the rest of his life. And I would like to think that if I did something, that the person could find it within their heart to forgive me. And I reckon there's young men and women all over Northern Ireland that because of the conditions that existed there, and I mean on all sides of the political spectrum, that have done things that in a normal society they wouldn't have done. Am I justifying it? No, I'm not. What I'm saying is that you also have got to deal with the conditions that create the circumstances to allow things to happen. What made Charles think it was all right to fire a rubber bullet at a group of children? He comes from a society that at that time would have supported what he did, no matter what he did. That society has got to be questioned. You can see it today. There's violence all over the world. There are elements of society that justify and support what is happening in other parts of the world. And I honestly believe the minute you begin to support violence, the minute you begin to justify violence, the minute you begin to say, yes, but these circumstances are different, then I think we're on the wrong path. But I suppose that's a process that I've gone through in my head on many occasions, and I know it's there to be questioned, and it's a debate, and it's a subject matter that people can get their teeth into in many ways. I'm not saying it's entirely right, but it's how I feel. And, there's no question about it, Charles took away my eyesight. I have to live with that for the rest of my life. But I don't think Charles is a bad person. I don't think he got up that morning to blind a 10-year-old boy. I think that sometimes good people do bad things. I think sometimes people make a decision that is dreadfully wrong, and they don't have the time or the space or They know how at that point in time to make a decision or to think about it. And in my case, I think Charles is a good person. But he comes from a completely different background from me. He was a captain, retired a major in the army. He was a captain when he shot me. His father was in the army or the Air Force. His grandfather. I think one of the times I was talking to Charles' son, and he said to me that he, Charles' son, was the first person in their family to have not been in the military in 600 years. So I think completely different from me. And I have to accept that. And the thing about reconciliation, and the thing about if you really are genuine about trying to reconcile, then you've got to take people from where they're at. And that's what I done with Charles. And I'm a lot happier for it. I really am.
Finally, Richard, if anybody wants to find out more about Children in Crossfire or even more about you, how could they do it?
Well, if you just go on the Children in Crossfire website, which is childreninCrossfire.org, and on there you'll see all the work that Children in Crossfire is doing. You can also, there's an email link there that you can send an email. If it's for me, it'll come to me. I get the email if it's meant for me. And or there's I think there's a page on the website about Richard Moore as well. I think there is. I've never looked at it. I'm not going to admit to it anyway. I look at it every day, tell the truth. But so I think there is a page or something there if people want to find out more. But I'm always happy to chat or listen to people. So I'm very accessible, I think. So they could also ring the Children in Crossfire office in Derry, which is what is it, +44 2871 269 898. But I sincerely hope that anybody that listens and wants to know more about the organisation also is willing to support us, because we need as much support as we can get.
Great, Richard. Look, it's been a pleasure talking to you, and I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Mícheál. I enjoyed it too.
Thanks for listening to another show of The Health Zone. Tune in next week for more exciting and interesting topics and guests in the areas of spirituality, relationships, finance, creativity, health, career, and much, much more. In the meantime, check out and like our Facebook page on www.facebook.com/The Health Zone Show, or follow us on Twitter on the letter D Health Zone, or log on to our website www.thehealthzoneshow.com. If you subscribe to our mailing list on there, you will get the Health Zone Show delivered to your inbox every week, and also you'll get a copy of our free book called How to Transform Your Health in 2016. Also, if you have any feedback on the show, or if you would like to get in touch with us, our email is tunein@thehealthzoneshow.com. Well, until next week, have a fantastic, healthy and happy week.